The rain didn't just fall on Oakwood Cemetery that grey Tuesday. It seemed to punish the earth, soaking the black velvet of mourning clothes and turning the freshly turned soil into thick, dark mud. The sky over Connecticut was the color of an old bruise, heavy and oppressive, reflecting the somber mood hanging over the 50 people gathered around the polished mahogany casket. The smell was a sickening mix of wet earth, decaying white lilies, and the metallic scent of cold rain mixed with expensive perfume. In the center of that tableau of desolation, Richard Sterling was crumbling. He leaned over the casket of his wife, Elena, his body convulsing in sobs that seemed to tear at his throat. To any casual observer, this was the definitive image of devastation. A broken man, a husband who had lost his better half, a widower whose life had lost all meaning. He clawed at the cold wood of the coffin, as if his fingernails could stop Elena from being lowered into the ground, his shoulders shaking violently under his soaked Armani suit. Why her? Why now? Richard howled, his hoarse voice cutting through the monotonous sound of the rain. The people around him lowered their heads, uncomfortable and moved by the raw display of pain. Women wiped away discreet tears with silk handkerchiefs. Men clenched their jaws, sympathizing with the tragedy of this young businessman who, overnight, found himself alone in the vast Sterling mansion. But standing apart from the main circle, under the protection of a discreet black umbrella, was a man who wasn't crying. He wasn't moved. He wasn't even sad. Dr. Arthur Vance was, above all, working. His eyes, a nice blue shade of analytical coldness, didn't see a funeral. They saw a data set. He didn't hear grief. He heard vocal frequencies. He didn't see tears. He saw the physiology of lacrymal secretion. Vance, a human behavior expert who had consulted for federal agencies and global corporations, was there at the request of an old friend of Elena's family, but his mind never switched off. He watched Richard with the precision of a hawk circling wounded prey. Vance knew that true grief is disorganized. Real mourning steals your breath, makes your legs fail, shuts down cognition. But Richard was performing. Vance noticed how, between one sob and another, Richard subtly adjusted his posture to ensure his best angle was visible to the majority of those present. He saw how the husband checked his footing in the slippery mud, maintaining a balance that a truly devastated man would have lost long ago. And then it happened, the moment that would change everything. An elderly aunt of Elena's, hands trembling with age and cold, approached Richard to offer a comforting hug. She murmured inaudible words about God's inheritance and eternal rest. Richard lifted his face, cheeks glistening with what appeared to be copious tears. He accepted the embrace, burying his face in the old lady's shoulder. It was in that instant, when Richard thought his face was hidden by the fur collar of his aunt's coat, that the mask slipped. It lasted less time than a blink of an eye, approximately 200 milliseconds. As the aunt patted his back, the left corner of Richard's mouth twitched upward. It wasn't a spasm of pain. In Dr. Vance's encyclopedic mind, the analysis was instant and clinical. Zygomaticus major muscle activated unilaterally. Absence of contraction in the corrugator supercilium orbicularis oculi. This isn't anguish. This is duping delight, the pleasure of the deceiver. Richard wasn't suffering. He was celebrating. That micro smile was a silent scream of triumph, an internal toast to the success of a performance that would net him millions of dollars. Richard's body was screaming the truth, his mouth was keeping silent, and Arthur Vance was the only one listening. If you have ever felt, at some point in your life, that inexplicable intuition that someone was lying to you, even without proof, you know how disturbing it can be. That feeling that something is off is your primitive brain trying to alert you to danger. If you like stories where the truth is revealed through details no one else sees, please subscribe to the channel and like this video right now. It helps us keep unraveling the mysteries of the human mind. Now, back to the cemetery. As the coffin began to slowly descend into the grave, the sound of chains creaking sounded like a mechanical lament. Vance shifted his gaze from Richard to the only other person who seemed out of sync with the suffering widower narrative. Sarah, Elena's younger sister, stood a few yards away. She had no umbrella. Water streamed down her blonde hair, plastering it to her pale, thin face, but she didn't seem to notice the cold. Her eyes were fixed on Richard, and there was no compassion in them. There was hate, pure, distilled, powerless hate. Her hands were clenched into fists so tight, her knuckles were white, and her nails were surely piercing the skin of her palms. Vance observed Sarah's breathing. It was short, shallow, clavicular. She was in a state of fight or flight, frozen by social convention, but ready to attack. She knew. Maybe she didn't know how, but she knew what. The official story, the one the Connecticut police had accepted with disappointing speed, was simple and tragic. Elena Sterling, heiress to a real estate fortune, had tripped on the mansion's main staircase during the night. She went down to get a glass of water, lost her balance on the newly installed carpet, and fell, breaking her neck. Instant death. Richard, according to his statement, was sleeping soundly in the guest room because he had an early meeting the next morning and didn't want to wake her with his alarm. He found her in the morning, cold and motionless, in the marble foyer. A domestic accident, common, tragic, and extremely convenient, considering the prenuptial agreement had a validity clause expiring in 2 months. But Elena's will left everything to her husband in the event of death, regardless of the date. The ceremony ended. People began to disperse toward their luxury cars, eager to escape the rain and head to the reception at the Sterling mansion, where there would be heaters, brandy, and whispered gossip. Richard, now composed but still maintaining the facade of fragility, was supported by 2 friends as he walked to the limousine. Vance waited. He watched Sarah stay behind, staring at the hole in the earth where her sister now rested. He approached her slowly, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the wet grass. "Anger is a dangerous fuel, Sarah," Vance said softly, his calm voice cutting through the sound of the rain. "It burns too fast and leaves only ash if not directed correctly." Sarah turned sharply, startled. Her eyes were red, swollen, but the ferocity in them didn't dim. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling with cold and emotion. "Someone who saw what you saw," Vance replied, keeping a respectful distance. "Someone who knows his crying is as fake as the plastic flowers on a cheap grave." Sarah's breath hitched. For the first time in days, someone was validating the madness screaming in her head. "He killed her," she whispered, the words coming out as steam in the freezing air. "I told the police. I told all of them. Elena would never trip. She was a ballerina. She had the balance of a cat, and she hated going down those stairs in the dark. She always turned on the hallway lights, but the police said the lights were off. They said, 'I'm in shock that I'm looking for someone to blame to ease my pain. Police work with physical evidence, Sarah.' And Richard was careful," Vance explained. "But the human body doesn't know how to lie. The conscious mind can construct an alibi, but the limbic system, the part of the brain that controls emotions, is brutally honest. Richard made a mistake today." He smiled. Sarah looked nauseous for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "Now we need to prove it." Vance extended a white card, simple, with just his name and number. "I'm going to the reception at the house. I need you to do something very difficult. I need you to act normal. Do not confront him. Do not scream. Let him think he won. Arrogance is the Achilles heel of psychopaths." Sarah took the card, looking at Vance as if he were an anchor thrown in the middle of a storm. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to talk to him," Vance said, a cold glint passing through his eyes. "I'm going to ask the questions the police forgot, and I'm going to watch him fall apart, piece by piece." The Sterling mansion was an architectural imposition of stone and glass, rising on a hill overlooking a grey lake. Inside, the place smelled of old money and recent tragedy. The foyer, where Elena had died, was impeccably clean, the white marble gleaming under the gigantic crystal chandelier. There was no sign of blood, no police tape. Life, or the simulation of it, went on. Vance entered, handing his coat to a staff member. The environment was warm, a violent contrast to the cold of the cemetery. Waiters circulated with silver trays, containing connips no one really wanted to eat, but everyone accepted out of politeness. The murmur of conversations was low, respectful, a constant hum of hollow condolences. Richard was in the main living room, holding a glass of whiskey. He looked exhausted, tie loosened, hair slightly disheveled, a calculated touch to show despair. He was surrounded by a small group of business associates who, even at a funeral, couldn't switch off corporate mode. Vance grabbed a glass of sparkling water and began his approach. He needed to establish a baseline, Richard's normal behavior in a low-stress situation, before he started applying pressure. He watched Richard interact. The widower was charming, articulate. He touched people's arms when he spoke, tilted his head to listen. A skilled social manipulator. "Richard," said a tall, grey-haired man next to him, "if you need anything at the firm, take as much time as necessary. We'll handle everything." "Thank you, John," Richard replied, his voice choked up just the right amount. I can't even think about spreadsheets right now. Everything in this house reminds me of her. Every corner, ... Vance took the cue. He inserted himself into the circle with the fluidity of someone who belongs anywhere. "Spatial memory is fascinating, isn't it?" he said, his voice calm but projected to capture attention. "How physical objects anchor our emotions." Richard turned to him, eyes narrowing slightly. He didn't recognize Vance, and that made him alert. A predator doesn't like unknown variables in his territory. "I'm sorry, have we been introduced?" Richard asked, politeness barely masking suspicion. "Arthur Vance. I was a consultant, close to Elena's family some years ago." Vance lied with the ease of breathing. The lie was necessary to lower Richard's logical defenses. "I am so sorry for your loss." Elena was an extraordinary woman. "She was," Richard agreed, relaxing his shoulders. "Thank you for coming, Arthur." "I was admiring the house," Vance continued, looking round. "The renovation turned out incredible. Elena always had impeccable taste. The staircase carpet, ... That's New Zealand wool, isn't it? The kind that has a more oily texture to repel dirt." The question was bizarre, totally out of context for a wake. It was a pattern interrupt technique. Richard's brain was primed to receive condolences, not questions about interior design. Richard froze. It was subtle, but Vance saw it. The hand holding the whiskey glass stopped halfway to his mouth. His pupils, which were normal under the room's yellow light, suddenly dilated, swallowing the irisan automatic response of the sympathetic nervous system to a threat. His brain made the instant connection. Carpet, stairs, fall, greater than death, guilt. I believe so," Richard stammered, recovering quickly, but not quickly enough. He brought his free hand to his neck, massaging the side, right below the ear. "Bingo," thought Vance. Neck touching, pacifying behavior. He's trying to soothe the vagus nerve. He feels threatened. "It's an interesting choice," Vance continued, keeping his tone casual, almost bored. "Beautiful, but treacherous. That type of fiber, when new, has a very low coefficient of friction. It's almost like stepping on ice if you're wearing socks." Elena was wearing socks, wasn't she? The air around them seemed to thin. The other men in the circle looked at Vance strangely, finding the comment insensitive, but Richard was pale. I don't remember the details of her clothing, Arthur, Richard said, his voice hardening. It was a horrible night. My wife died. I wasn't analyzing floor friction. Of course. Forgive my analytical mind, Vance retreated, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. Occupational hazard. I work with risk analysis. Sometimes I see danger where there is only bad luck. Vance took a step back, allowing Richard to breathe. He had planted the seed. He had told Richard, I see something. Now, he needed to water that seed with fear. He moved away from the group, but kept Richard in his peripheral vision. The widower didn't go back to chatting with the same ease. He glanced at Vance sideways every few seconds. Paranoia had been installed. Vance walked to a large window overlooking the back garden. Sarah was out there, under a gazebo, smoking a cigarette nervously. Vance didn't go to her. He needed to stay inside, where the prey was. He began to circle the room, reading the environment. Photos of Elena and Richard adorned the tables. Perfect smiles, vacations in Bali, dinners in Paris. But Vance noticed something in the more recent photos, the ones from 6 months ago. In the old photos, Richard leaned toward Elena. Their torsos touched. In the recent photos, there was a gap. Richard tilted his head toward the photo, but his hips were turned away from her. Subconscious distancing. He had checked out of the relationship emotionally, long before she died. And then Vance saw the woman. She was in the opposite corner of the room, near the library. Brunette, young, dressed in black that was a little too tight, a little too short for a conservative funeral. She wasn't talking to anyone. She was just watching. And who was she watching? Richard. Vance intercepted the line of sight. Richard, across the room, looked at the woman and, almost imperceptibly, shook his head no. A silent command. Don't come over here. Not now. The woman lowered her eyes, submissive, and took an aggressive sip of her wine. The mistress, Vance concluded. Classic, banal, but dangerous. Her presence there was a huge risk, which meant Richard didn't have total control over her. Or his arrogance was so great, he thought he could parade his conquest at his wife's wake. Vance decided it was time to turn up the heat. He approached Richard again. He was now alone, pouring himself another generous dose of alcohol. You know, Richard, Vance began, stopping beside him at the makeshift bar. There's an old saying in my line of work, the weight of conscience is the only thing gravity can't pull down. It floats. It rises to the throat. Richard slammed the glass onto the table with excessive force. The sound of crystal against wood echoed, causing a few heads to turn. Who the hell are you anyway? Richard hissed, abandoning the sad widower facade. His eyes were narrow, lips compressed until they disappeared, a clear sign of suppressed anger and withholding information. You come into my house, drink my wine, and talk nonsense about carpets and conscience. I should kick you out right now. You could, Vance said calmly, maintaining intense eye contact, unblinking. But that would cause a scene. And you hate scenes, don't you? You like control. Everything clean, everything perfect. Like that accident. Vance used a conversational hypnosis technique called an embedded command. He slightly lowered his tone on the word accident, marking it for Richard's subconscious. Are you implying something? Richard took a step forward, invading Vance's personal space, a physical intimidation tactic. Vance didn't retreat a millimeter. I don't imply, Richard. I observe that you are wearing the tie Elena gave you for your last birthday, but you tied it with a double Windsor knot, which is bulky and assertive. You want to look powerful today, not sad. I observe that when you talk about her death, you use the past tense to describe the house was ours, as if it didn't belong to her long before today. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Vance cut him off, leaning in to whisper, as if sharing an intimate secret. "And I observe that you look at the woman in the black dress near the library every 3 minutes and 14 seconds. On average. Her name is Jessica, I assume, or maybe Ashley. She looks impatient, Richard. Impatient lovers are ... sloppy. They leave trails." Richard's face drained of all color. It was as if the blood had been sucked down a drain. He looked at the woman, then at Vance, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The Mentalist had hit an exposed nerve. It didn't matter if Vance knew her name or not. The fact that he had noticed the connection was terrifying for Richard. "You're crazy," Richard whispered, but there was no conviction. There was panic. "Maybe," Vance said, returning to his normal tone and smiling slightly. "Or maybe I'm the only person here who really sees you. And what I see, Richard, is a man holding the door shut with all his might, while a tsunami is building on the other side." At that moment, Sarah entered the room. She was wet, shivering, but her eyes met Vance's. He gave a micro-nod. "It's working." Richard followed Vance's gaze and saw Sarah. His anger found an easier target. "Sarah," he shouted, too loud for the room. "For God's sake, look at you. You're soaking the floor. Have some respect for your sister's memory and go upstairs to dry off or leave." The room went silent. The cruelty in Richard's voice was palpable. He was losing control of his good guy narrative. The stress induced by Vance was making the cracks appear. Sarah, instructed by Vance, didn't scream back. She just looked at him with an icy calm and said, "I just wanted to see the flowers, Richard. The flowers you chose. Lilies." Alina hated lilies. The smell gave her migraines. "Did you forget that too?" Richard froze. He had forgotten. A tiny detail, but devastating. He had ordered the most expensive flowers without thinking of his wife's preference. She isn't here to smell them," Richard retorted, a callous response that made guests exchange uncomfortable glances. Vance watched it all. He was cataloguing every slip-up, but he needed more. He needed a confession, or something so close to it that it was irrefutable. He needed to push Richard to the edge. "Richard," Vance intervened, placing a friendly hand on the widower's shoulder. Richard's trapezius muscle was hard as a rock under the suit. Extreme tension. "Let me help you. You're under a lot of pressure. Let's go to the study. I need to show you something about ... the finances. Something Alina left that maybe you don't know about." It was the final bait. Greed. Vance knew that fear of financial loss was the only motivator greater than fear of prison for a man like Richard. Richard hesitated, looking at his mistress, at Sarah, and finally at Vance. Greed won. "Fine," Richard said. "Let's go to the study. But make it brief." As they walked down the hallway toward the dark oak study at the end of the house, Vance knew he was entering the lion's den, but Richard didn't know he wasn't the lion in this story. He was the gazelle, and Vance was about to snap his jaws shut. Upon entering the study, Vance closed the door silently. The sound of the rain outside was muffled, distant. The silence in the room was heavy, charged with static electricity. "So," Richard said, moving behind his massive desk, seeking the protection of the physical barrier. "What did Alina leave that I don't know about?" Vance didn't sit. He walked around the room, touching books, objects. "You know, Richard, the human mind is like a hard drive. Nothing is ever truly deleted. We just remove the shortcuts to the files. But the data remains there. The image of her falling, the sound of her neck snapping, the exact time you waited before calling emergency services. Get out of here," Richard ordered, his voice low and dangerous. He opened a desk drawer. Vance heard the unmistakable metallic sound. "A gun, maybe." "I will leave," Vance said, turning to face him. "But first, you need to know why I noticed your smile at the cemetery." "I didn't smile," Richard shouted, slamming the desk. "You smiled," Vance stated with absolute authority. And you smiled because you thought you got rid of the problem. But you forgot one thing, Richard. One fundamental thing about modern technology and about your wife's paranoia. Vance pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen was black. Elena didn't trust you, Vance continued. Not for the last few months. She thought you were siphoning money, so she installed something in this house. Not common security cameras, which you know and control. She installed nanny cams. Hidden cameras the size of a pinhead, independent of the house system, with their own battery and cloud upload. This was a bluff, a monumental bluff. Vance had no idea if these cameras existed, but he was betting everything on Richard's reaction. If he were innocent, he would be confused. If he were guilty, Richard wasn't confused. His eyes shot involuntarily to a specific spot on the bookshelf behind Vance, to a small decorative teddy bear, an antique Elena collected. There, thought Vance. He knows there's something there. Or he checked that spot before. You're looking at the bear, Richard, Vance said softly. Why? Did you find a camera there? Did you remove it? Destroy the memory card? Richard began to laugh. A dry, humorless laugh. You're good. Very good. But you're bluffing. I checked this house inch by inch. There are no cloud cameras. Elena barely knew how to use iCloud. Maybe, said Vance. But what if she had help? What if she hired someone? Like me? The silence that followed was deafening. The silence in Richard's study wasn't empty. It was dense, filled with a latent violence that made the air feel heavier. Vance's question asterisk, what if she had help? Asterisk hung between them like the smoke of a freshly fired gun. Richard didn't answer with words. His right hand, which had been partially hidden inside the open drawer of the oak desk, moved. With a fluid but trembling motion, he withdrew a black matte object, a Glock 19. He didn't point it directly at Vance's head, but held it low, aimed at the Mentalist's stomach. The barrel of the gun looked like a black, lifeless eye staring at the intruder. You broke into my house, Richard said, his voice now devoid of any social charm. It was a metallic, cold voice. You are harassing a grieving man. If I shoot you now, the law will call it self-defense, home invasion, threat. Vance didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. His heart rate, trained by years of meditation and autonomic control, remained stable. He looked at the gun, then at Richard's eyes. Your index finger is extended along the trigger guard, not on the trigger, Vance observed, with the casual tone of someone commenting on the weather. That's trigger discipline, Richard, learned at sport shooting ranges, not on the street. But it also indicates hesitation. Your reptilian brain wants to shoot, but your prefrontal cortex is calculating the risk. You are a businessman, after all. You calculate ROI, return on investment. Get out, Richard snarled, raising the gun a few inches. The ROI of killing me is negative, Vance continued, ignoring the order. He took a step toward the gun, a counterintuitive maneuver designed to confuse the aggressor. If you shoot, the police will do a full ballistic forensic analysis. They'll find gunshot residue on your hands, of course, but they'll also turn this house upside down. And if they turn the house upside down, they'll find what you hid in the wall safe behind that hideous fox-hunting painting. Richard's eyes darted to the painting on the side wall. A classic tell. Vance didn't know if there was a safe there. It was a deduction based on the painting's position. It was slightly misaligned, suggesting frequent use. Richard's reaction confirmed everything. You're a bluffer, Richard said, but the gun lowered slightly. Doubt had been planted. Maybe, said Vance. But do you want to pay to see? Sarah is outside. She knows I'm here with you. If I don't walk out that door in 30 seconds, she starts screaming. And with the house full of important witnesses, well, your perfect widower theater crumbles. Richard clenched his jaw. He was cornered by logic. Killing Vance would create chaos he couldn't control. Get out, Richard repeated, holstering the gun with anger. If I see you near my family or my property again, I won't hesitate. Understood, said Vance. He turned to leave but stopped with his hand on the doorknob. He needed to leave one last mental virus in Richard's head. He turned back and looked directly at Richard's shirt collar. By the way, Richard, you should have checked your shirt better before coming downstairs. There is a tiny smudge of liquid foundation on the collar. Shade beige 04, I'd say. The same shade Jessica wears. It would be hard to complain how your mistress's makeup ended up on your shirt on the day of your wife's funeral. Richard instinctively brought his hand to his neck, covering the collar. Vance smiled, a cold, predatory smile, and left the room. There was no smudge, but now Richard would spend the next 10 minutes in the mirror, frantically searching, sweating, spiking his cortisol and adrenaline levels. He would be destabilized, ready to make mistakes. Back in the main hall, the atmosphere was stifling. The rain outside had turned into a torrential storm, thunder making the double-pane windows vibrate. Vance found Sarah near the buffet table. She looked about to faint. "Did he hurt you?" she asked, grabbing Vance's arm. "Not physically," Vance replied, "but I hurt him psychologically. He's paranoid now. He's afraid, and fear makes people act on impulse. So now what? What do we do?" "Now we wait for the mistake, and it will happen in..." Vance checked his wristwatch. 3, 2, 1. The study door flew open violently. Richard stepped out. He had changed his shirt. Vance almost laughed. The confirmation of guilt was in the wardrobe change. Richard believed the lie about the makeup smudge so blindly that he went to change his shirt in the middle of his own wake. Erratic behavior that drew everyone's attention. Richard walked straight to Jessica, the mistress. He grabbed her by the arm with excessive force and whispered something aggressive in her ear. Jessica recoiled, frightened, knocking her glass of red wine onto the white Persian rug. The sound of shattering glass silenced the hall. The red stain spread across the rug like fresh blood. "You idiot," Richard hissed, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Everyone looked. The mask of the suffering widower was slipping. Aggression didn't match grief. Vance saw the opportunity. It was checkmate time. He walked to the center of the room, near where the wine was spreading. "Accidents happen, don't they, Richard?" Vance said, his voice projected to fill the awkward silence. "Red stains on a white floor, broken glass. Is that a familiar image to you?" Richard let go of Jessica's arm and turned to Vance. His eyes were bloodshot, wild. "You... get out of my house. Now. I'm calling the police." "Please do call," challenged Vance. "Actually, I took the liberty of texting Detective Miller 10 minutes ago. He should be pulling up to the gate right about now." A murmur of shock rippled through the guests. "What are you talking about?" Richard tried to laugh, but it sounded like a nervous bark. "This man is crazy. He's harassing me and my guests." Vance turned to the audience. He needed to win the crowd to isolate the predator. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for interrupting this solemn moment. But there is a truth that needs to be spoken, because the dead cannot speak. But the bodies of the living, oh, the bodies of the living can't shut up." Vance pointed at Richard. "Look at him. Look at his hands." Everyone looked. Richard's hands were trembling uncontrollably. "Psychogenic tremor," Vance explained, "occurs when the nervous system is overloaded by the suppression of a traumatic truth." Richard isn't shaking from grief. He's shaking from fear. "This is ridiculous," shouted the family attorney, stepping forward. "Who are you?" "I am someone who saw Richard smile when Elena's casket went into the ground," Vance said, dropping the bomb. A collective gasp. Sarah began to cry silently. "Liar!" Richard bellowed, veins bulging in his neck. "I loved my wife. I cried for her. I'm still crying." And indeed, tears began to stream down Richard's face. He was a consummate actor, capable of summoning emotion on demand. Vance walked until he was face to face with Richard. The tension was palpable. "You are crying, Richard." That's true, Vance said, analyzing the killer's face with clinical coldness. But let's observe the physiology. Your tears started falling from your left eye first. Vance turned to the guests, assuming the role of a professor in a macabre lecture. There is an interesting theory in behavioral neurobiology. In right-handed people, like Richard, the right side of the brain processes genuine emotions and controls the left side of the face. But when an emotion is forced, logically manufactured by the left hemisphere, facial innovation often betrays the actor. Unilateral tears, especially starting from the left eye in a context of manipulation, often indicate a conscious attempt to simulate sadness. It is crocodile tears in their purest biological form. Richard wiped his face furiously. That's pseudoscience. You're a charlatan. Could be, Vance conceded, lowering his voice to a whisper that only Richard could hear, leaning in for the final blow, the microclimax. But forensic science isn't. Richard, ... When you pushed Alina, she tried to hold on. She scratched you, not on the face, where it would be visible, but on the arm, on your left forearm. You're wearing long sleeves and changed your shirt to ensure blood wouldn't seep through. But the wound is there. And under Elena's fingernails, ... Your skin DNA is preserved. This wasn't true. The police hadn't found skin under Elena's nails, or Richard would already be in jail. But Richard didn't know what the police had or hadn't found. He only knew that Elena had scratched him. He felt the stinging of the scratch under the expensive suit fabric right now. The reaction was visceral. Richard recoiled, as if he had been electrocuted, grabbing his left forearm with his right hand, protecting the wound. How do you know, ... quotes Richard started, and then stopped. His eyes went wide. He had just confessed. The silence in the room was absolute. Richard's incomplete question asterisk. How do you know asterisk was the admission that there was something to know. I didn't know, said Vance, his voice echoing in the silent hall, until you protected the wound site just now. Thank you for the confirmation, Richard. Richard looked around. The faces of friends, partners, family, they had all changed. Goud had turned into horror. They saw the movement. They saw the guilt. No, it wasn't like that, Richard stammered, backing toward the terrace door. It was an accident. She attacked me. She was hysterical. I just pushed her to defend myself. She was hysterical because she found out about Jessica, Vance said, pointing to the mistress, who was now sobbing copiously in the corner. She was going to write you out of the will. The prenup was about to expire. You were going to be left with nothing, so you accelerated the process. She was worthless. Richard exploded, the mask falling completely, revealing a face twisted with pure hate. She was pathetic, needy. I deserved that money. I put up with her for 5 years. The confession echoed off the marble walls. At that moment, blue and red lights illuminated the rainy windows. The police had arrived. Not because Vance called. That was also a bluff, but because Sarah, following Vance's instructions, had called 911 the moment Richard changed his shirt, reporting that he was armed and unstable. 2 uniformed officers entered through the front door, hands on their holsters. Richard Sterling, the officer asked. Richard looked at the police, then at the open terrace door, at the dark rain outside. For a second, he considered running, but Vance was in the way. It's over, Richard, said Vance. The game is finished, and you lost, Richard crumbled. Not the theatrical crying of the funeral, but a real collapse. His knees gave way. He fell onto the wine-stained rug, sobbing, an ugly, guttural sound of a caged animal. As Richard was handcuffed and led out, under the rain that now seemed to wash the filth from that house, Sarah approached Vance. She looked exhausted, but her shoulders were light for the first time. How did you know? She asked. About the scratch? The police said her nails were clean. Vance looked at the door Richard had exited through. I didn't know, admitted Vance, but I knew Alina was a fighter. I saw her photos, her posture. She wouldn't go down without a fight. I bet on Elena's human nature against Richard's arrogance, and human nature always wins. Sarah looked at Vance, and for the first time, a genuine, albeit sad, smile appeared on her face. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," said Vance, putting on his coat. "Thank your sister. She left the truth marked on his skin, even if invisible. I just helped bring it to light." Vance left the mansion and stepped into the rainy night. He opened his black umbrella and walked toward his car. He didn't look back. For him, the case was closed. The data was processed. The anomaly was corrected. As he drove away, Vance's voice narrated one last reflection, deep and resonant, on the human condition. We spend our lives building masks. Masks of success, of happiness, of innocence. We believe that if the mask is perfect enough, it will become our face. But we forget that biology doesn't lie. The body is a historical archive of every sin, every fear, every hidden desire. Richard thought he could fool the world with an expensive suit and some fake tears, but he forgot that the truth is like water. No matter how tight you clench your fist, it always finds a way to slip through your fingers. In the end, we are all transparent. You just have to know where to look. If this story made you hold your breath and question how well we can really know someone, leave a comment below saying, "The body doesn't lie." Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories where psychology meets mystery, and justice is served in ways you never imagined. Turn on the notification bell, because the next story will make you doubt your own neighbors. Until next time.